A single speech could once decide the fate of an entire civilization. We are traveling back to the ancient world, where political debates were not just discussions, but the very engines that drove history forward. By the end of this journey, you will understand the 25 pivotal arguments that built the foundations of democracy itself. We will uncover how a public clash over debt slavery reshaped citizenship and why a debate about building a navy unexpectedly empowered the common people. These verbal battles, from the Athenian agora to the Roman forum, established principles that still echo in our governments today. What do you believe is the most important quality for a leader in a free society? Think of a time before microphones or recording devices, when the only way to reach your entire city was with the power of your own voice. This was the reality of the ancient world, and the primary stage for this political drama was the Pnyx, a hillside in Athens carved into a natural amphitheater. Here, thousands of citizens would gather from sunrise, ready to listen, to argue, and to decide the fate of their city-state. The air was thick with dust and the buzz of conversation, a palpable energy that shifted with every speech. A skilled orator did not just present facts, he performed, using every tool of rhetoric, logic, and raw charisma to win over the crowd. His success or failure in that moment could launch a military expedition, impose a new tax, or banish a rival. This culture of public debate was the very lifeblood of citizenship. For an Athenian man, to be a citizen was to participate, to speak, and to be heard. It was an education in itself, forging a society that prized active involvement and personal responsibility in governance. This crucible of direct, unscripted discourse is where our story truly begins, setting the stage for the monumental clashes of ideas that would redefine everything. Athens was on the brink of civil war. The city's fields were littered with horoi, the stone markers that signified a farmer's land was pledged to a wealthy creditor. For many, that debt had become a life sentence, forcing them and their families into a form of bondage known as debt slavery. The entire social order was fracturing under the weight of this economic injustice, pitting the common people, the demos, against a small, powerful aristocracy. It was into this explosive atmosphere that the aristocrat Solon was thrust, granted extraordinary powers to mediate a solution. The debate he faced was not a simple policy discussion. It was a fundamental question about the nature of the state itself. Would Athens continue to be governed for the exclusive benefit of the wealthy few, or could it be reshaped to include and protect the many? Solon's genius lay in his refusal to take sides in the traditional sense. He argued passionately that the city's survival depended on a new concept of balance, or eunomia. To the outrage of his own class, he declared that relieving the suffering of the poor was not an act of charity, but a political necessity. The result was the seisachtheia, a phrase meaning the shaking off of burdens. With a single legislative act, Solon cancelled all outstanding debts. He did not just erase numbers from ledgers, he physically removed the horoi from the fields, and most dramatically, freed every Athenian who had been enslaved because of debt. Imagine the scene as families were reunited and citizens, once considered property, walked out of bondage and back into the political community. This was a revolution in thought. For the first time, a law explicitly stated that a person's political rights were inherent and could not be erased by economic misfortune. A citizen was a citizen, regardless of whether he was rich or poor. By breaking the direct link between wealth and political standing, Solon fundamentally redefined what it meant to be an Athenian. He created a broader, more resilient political body, one where every member had a stake in the city's stability. This precedent for legislative intervention in the name of economic justice planted a seed, the radical idea that the law could be a tool for fairness, not just for preserving power. This single debate established a principle that would echo for centuries, that the strength of a democracy is measured by the freedom and inclusion of its poorest citizens. Solon had broken the chains of debt, but the old aristocratic families still held the real power, their influence woven into the very fabric of Athenian life through ancient family clans. When a tyrant named Pisistratus and his sons seized control, they proved that without a structural change, the freedom of the common citizen was always vulnerable. After the tyranny fell, Athens stood at another precipice. The old elites were ready to reclaim their dominance, and the city risked sliding back into the same cycle of factional strife. It was then that an aristocrat named Cleisthenes stepped onto the stage with a proposal so radical it seemed to his peers like political suicide. His great debate was not about a single law, but about the entire architecture of power. He argued that the only way to secure lasting freedom was to dismantle the traditional tribal system, a system where political loyalty was dictated by which powerful family you were born into. Cleisthenes claimed that true equality under the law, a concept the Greeks called isonomia, could not exist as long as a man's political identity was inherited. His solution was breathtakingly simple and utterly revolutionary. He would redraw the political map of Attica, not based on lineage but on geography. Every citizen was now registered by their deme, their local village or neighborhood. This was more than an administrative change. It was a complete redefinition of civic belonging. Your political power no longer came from your bloodline, but from your connection to the soil of Attica itself. To ensure no single region or old family could dominate, he then mixed these demes into 10 brand new tribes. Each tribe was a deliberate patchwork combining citizens from the coastal regions, the city center, and the inland farms. Why was this so brilliant? A man from a coastal fishing village now found himself in the same political tribe as a potter from the city and a farmer from the plains. Their local interests were different, but their political fate was now shared. This forced them to debate, to compromise, and to find common ground on issues that affected the entire state. The old noble factions, whose power had relied on commanding the loyalty of their own traditional tribes, were suddenly fractured and rendered almost powerless. The engine of this new system was the Council of 500, filled by lottery from members of all 10 tribes. For the first time, an ordinary farmer or artisan had a real, tangible chance to serve in the government, to debate policy, and to manage the day-to-day affairs of the city. This was the birth of structural democracy. Cleisthenes had engineered a system where political equality was not just an idea, but a built-in feature of the state itself. He shifted the source of a citizen's voice from the accident of his birth to the geography of his home, creating a democracy that was, for the first time, truly by and for the people. The power of the citizen now resided in the soil of Attica, but a far greater storm was gathering in the east. A new debate was about to test the very survival of this young democracy, a debate that would trade silver for ships and, in doing so, unleash an unexpected political revolution. Deep in the Laurium mines, a massive new vein of silver had been discovered, a treasure trove that promised instant wealth for every Athenian. The obvious and popular proposal was to simply divide the money amongst the people. But one man, a visionary strategist named Themistocles, stood before the assembly and argued for a radically different path. He saw not coins for citizens, but the timber and manpower for 200 warships. His opponents accused him of madness, of squandering the city's good fortune on a speculative and expensive military project. The Persian Empire, they argued, was a land power, and Athens' strength was in its hoplite infantry. Why gamble everything on the untested and unpredictable sea? Themistocles' genius was in framing his naval bill not as a mere military expenditure, but as the only viable future for Athenian power. He persuaded the people that their walls were not of stone, but of wood, the hulls of their triremes. He redefined the very geography of their defense, arguing that the sea would be their new frontier, a vast moat that could both protect them and project their influence across the known world. The assembly, swayed by his compelling vision of survival and empire, made a momentous choice. They voted to forego their individual payouts and fund the fleet. This single decision did more than just create a navy. It fundamentally reshaped the social and political landscape of Athens. The mighty trireme, a sleek and fast warship, required 170 rowers to power it into battle. This massive demand for manpower could not be met by the wealthy hoplite class alone. It fell to the Thetes, the poorest class of Athenian citizens, who owned little more than their own strength to pull the oars. Overnight, the survival of the city-state was placed directly into the hands of its most humble members. Their strong backs and coordinated effort became the engine of Athenian military might. When that fleet, powered by these common citizens, decisively defeated the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis, the political repercussions were immediate and irreversible. The Thetes returned home not as anonymous laborers, but as the acknowledged saviors of their civilization. How could a state deny political influence to the very men who had proven to be its ultimate defense? The balance of power shifted irrevocably. The old aristocracy, whose political dominance had been rooted in the land and the expensive armor of the hoplite, found their influence diluted. The rower, armed with only an oar, had secured a place at the very heart of Athenian democracy, his voice now amplified by the indispensable role he played. Themistocles' debate over silver and ships had proven that military strategy could be a powerful, if unintended, engine of social change, forging a more inclusive and robust democracy from the waters of a naval victory. The thunder of the trireme oars had faded, but a new sound now filled the Athenian air, the chilling wail of funeral dirges. A devastating war with Sparta had begun, and the city's public burial ground received its first casualties. In this moment of collective grief and fear, the statesman Pericles stepped forward to deliver his legendary funeral oration. His speech was far more than a eulogy for the fallen. It was a profound and urgent debate about the very soul of Athens itself. With the city's Spartan rivals watching, a society famous for its discipline and conformity, Pericles seized the moment to define his city by its glorious contrasts. He presented a vision of democracy that was not merely a set of political procedures, but an entire way of life. He declared that their strength was born from openness, not secrecy, and from tolerance, not enforced uniformity. He painted a picture of a society where citizens were free to live as they pleased, yet were always ready to answer the call of civic duty. This was a direct challenge to the Spartan model, a system built on obedience and militarism from childhood. Pericles argued that it was this very freedom, this vibrant and sometimes chaotic public life, that produced true courage and loyalty. A Spartan fought because he was compelled to, but an Athenian fought because he had a personal stake in the preservation of his unique world. His words codified the ideals of a meritocratic society, where a man was advanced in public life not because of his wealth or family name, but because of his ability and his service to the state. This rhetorical masterpiece gave the Athenians a mirror in which to see their own highest aspirations. It transformed their personal loss into a reaffirmation of their collective identity. elevating the concepts of civic duty and individual freedom from abstract principles into the cornerstones of a powerful and enduring state. In defining themselves against an adversary, they had created a timeless standard, a declaration of what a free society could be, a legacy that would far outlast the stones of their city. The ideals of Pericles were about to face their most brutal test. Far from the philosophic debates of the agora, a trireme sped towards the island of Lesbos, carrying a grim order from the Athenian assembly. The city of Mytilene had revolted, and in a fit of rage, the people had voted for a punishment of terrifying finality. Every male citizen was to be put to death, and every woman and child sold into slavery. It was a sentence designed to echo through history as a lesson in the cost of defiance. But as that ship sailed through the night, a profound unease settled over Athens. The very next day, the assembly was reconvened, not to celebrate their decisiveness, but to question it. A man named Diodotus stood to speak, and he ignited one of the most chilling and consequential debates in democratic history. He made a strategic choice that still feels startlingly modern. He did not appeal to mercy or to the gods. He did not argue that the decree was morally wrong. Instead, he met the assembly on its own pragmatic terms. He warned that such indiscriminate terror was a disastrous long-term strategy. If every rebel city knew that surrender meant utter annihilation, he argued, they would fight to the last breath, costing Athens more lives and treasure in every future conflict. Why would a city ever surrender if the penalty was the same for a long rebellion as for a short one? Furthermore, he pointed out the cold economic calculus that a dead population cannot pay tribute. An enslaved people cannot farm the land or produce goods for the Athenian Empire. He reframed the entire issue from one of righteous punishment to one of practical consequence. The debate that followed was not a simple clash of good versus evil, but a far more complex struggle between raw emotion and calculated reason. The initial vote had been born from fear and a desire for retribution, a collective passion that had swept through the crowd. Diodotus asked them to set that passion aside and think like stewards of an empire. In a stunning reversal, the assembly was persuaded. A second trireme was dispatched, its crew rowing with desperate urgency to overtake the first. They arrived just in time, finding the original order on the verge of being carried out. This dramatic turnaround established a vital democratic principle, the power of sober second thought. It proved that a democracy could correct its own catastrophic mistakes, that a decision made in anger could be unmade by cool-headed reasoning. The Mytilenean Debate forever highlighted the eternal tension within a free society, the struggle between the immediate hunger for justice and the long-term necessities of prudent governance. The fate of Mytilene had been decided by a razor-thin margin, a testament to democracy's capacity for second thoughts. But what happens when the target of a public vote is not a foreign city, but one of a citizen's own most respected leaders? The institution of ostracism presented this exact dilemma, a yearly safety valve where the assembly could vote to exile any individual for 10 years without a trial or even a specific crime. No single story captures the strange tension of this practice better than that of Aristides, a man whose entire public life was defined by a single nickname, the Just. The tale is told of an illiterate citizen approaching Aristides in the agora with a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon. Not recognizing the man he was about to vote against, the citizen asked Aristides to scratch the name Aristides onto the shard. Curious, Aristides asked what wrong this Aristides had ever done him. The man's reply was startling in its simplicity. He said, "None. I am just tired of hearing him called the Just." This moment cuts to the very heart of the debate that ostracism forced upon the Athenians. Was this a noble mechanism to protect the state from potential tyrants, a necessary sacrifice of individual careers for the collective security of the democracy? Or was it a deeply flawed tool that allowed envy and political paranoia to exile excellence itself? The procedure seemed almost designed for ambiguity. Each year, the assembly was first asked a simple question: is there anyone whom we should ostracize this year? If the vote was yes, a second assembly was held weeks later. On that day, citizens would bring their broken pieces of pottery, scratch a name upon them, and deposit them in the agora. If a minimum of 6,000 votes were cast, the individual with the most votes against him was given 10 days to leave Attica. His property was untouched, his family safe, his citizenship waiting for him upon his return. It was not a punishment, but a preemptive removal. The debate, therefore, was never about guilt or innocence. It was a perpetual, public conversation about the nature of power and popularity in a free society. How much influence was too much for one person to hold? Could a reputation for unwavering fairness, like that of Aristides, become so towering that it stifled the voices of others? The system acknowledged a painful truth, that a leader of immense talent and integrity could, by his very excellence, become a threat to the principle of equality. The citizens were effectively voting on a question we still grapple with today. Do we value competent leadership more than we fear the concentration of power? The exile of Aristides just suggests that on that day their fear won out. It was a vote for mediocrity over mastery, a chilling reminder that the will of the people, while powerful, is not always wise. This democratic tool, created to prevent the rise of a new tyrant, could itself become an engine of injustice, proving that no system is immune to the flaws of human nature. Athens was still reeling from the plague and the ongoing war with Sparta when a new and dazzling opportunity appeared on the horizon. A delegation from a distant Sicilian city arrived, pleading for Athenian support in a local conflict and offering a tempting prize in return: the wealth and grain of the entire island. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very soul of the democracy, pitting two of its most prominent citizens against each other in a battle of visions. On one side stood Alcibiades, a man of unmatched charisma, brilliant, ambitious, and relentlessly persuasive. He was Pericles' ward, but he possessed none of his mentor's caution. He stood before the assembly and did not merely propose a military campaign. He offered them a destiny. He painted a picture of an Athenian empire that stretched from the Aegean to the coasts of Italy and North Africa, a realm of unimaginable wealth and eternal glory. He argued that standing still was the true risk, that a city like Athens, born for greatness, must forever expand its power or face inevitable decline. His words were a siren song of ambition, appealing directly to the Athenian love of spectacle and renown. Against this intoxicating vision stood the seasoned general Nicias, a man revered for his piety and prudence. He had been a reluctant war hero, and now he became a reluctant prophet of doom. He pleaded with the assembly to see the practical realities. He detailed the staggering cost, the thousands of hoplites and hundreds of ships required, the vast distance that would stretch their supply lines to the breaking point. Most importantly, he warned that they were already fighting a formidable enemy at their doorstep in Sparta. To open a second front across the sea was not ambition, he argued, it was strategic insanity. He tried to dissuade them by presenting an absurdly large list of required forces, hoping the sheer scale would shock them into reason, but his tactic backfired spectacularly. The assembly, already intoxicated by Alcibiades' promises, interpreted Nicias' detailed requirements not as a warning, but as a blueprint for certain victory. They voted to give him everything he asked for and more. The decision was a triumph of emotion over evidence, of dazzling rhetoric over sober calculation. The fleet that sailed for Sicily was the most powerful expeditionary force ever assembled by a Greek city, a testament to Athenian power and ultimately to its hubris. The disaster that followed was as complete as Nicias had feared. The campaign bogged down into a brutal siege. Alcibiades, recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege, defected to Sparta. Nicias, left in command despite his own misgivings, hesitated at critical moments. The entire Athenian force was eventually trapped, destroyed, or enslaved. The city lost tens of thousands of its best men and nearly its entire fleet. The Sicilian expedition became the classic cautionary tale of democratic failure. It demonstrated with terrible clarity how a public, swept up in the passion of the moment and seduced by a charismatic leader, could vote its way to self-destruction. The debate between Alcibiades and Nicias was not just about Sicily. It was a timeless question for any free society. How do you temper the hunger for glory with the sober demands of survival? On that day, the desire for limitless empire drowned out the voice of prudence, and the echoes of that failure would haunt the corridors of power for centuries to come. The euphoria of victory at Arginusae was shockingly brief, replaced by a storm of grief and rage back in Athens. The city had won the naval battle, but a sudden, violent storm had prevented the commanders from rescuing hundreds of Athenian sailors clinging to the wreckage of their ships. As the bodies washed ashore, the public demanded a reckoning. The debate that followed was not held in the calm halls of justice, but in the volatile, emotional arena of the assembly. The proposal was unprecedented and horrifyingly simple: to try all 8 victorious generals together as a single group, bypassing the established legal process that guaranteed each man a separate hearing. On one side stood the voices of the crowd, their pain transformed into a demand for immediate collective punishment. They argued that the generals, as a command group, shared the ultimate responsibility for abandoning the city's sons to the sea. This was not a time for legal technicalities, they cried, but for swift, decisive justice. Standing against this tidal wave of emotion were a handful of men, including the philosopher Socrates, who served that day in the presiding council. He refused to be rushed, arguing with stubborn courage that it was illegal to try the citizens collectively. He insisted that every single man, no matter how grave the accusation, had an inviolable right to defend himself individually before a court. The law was the only shield a citizen had against the fury of the multitude, but the assembly, whipped into a frenzy by skilled orators playing on their anguish, would not listen. They shouted down the procedural objections and voted to execute all 8 generals. 6, including Pericles' own son, were captured and put to death. The other 2 had wisely fled the city. In the cold light of the following days, a profound sense of shame and horror settled over Athens. The city came to realize that in its grief, it had committed a terrible injustice, allowing the raw, impulsive will of the majority to override the very legal principles that defined a civilized state. This tragic event forced a painful but essential democratic reckoning. It carved into the city's memory a permanent lesson that popular sovereignty has its limits. The rule of law and fair procedure are not obstacles to the people's will, but the essential foundations that protect every citizen from the people's will when it turns into a mob. This hard-won principle that no one should be stripped of their right to an individual defense would become a cornerstone for legal systems across the world, a legacy born from the wreckage of a storm and a fateful vote. The emotional scars from the Arginusae trial were still fresh, a stark reminder of the law's power to fail its citizens. But decades earlier, a different kind of law had been proposed, one that would redefine the very meaning of being an Athenian from the ground up. It was Pericles, the same voice that had so eloquently praised Athenian openness, who now stood to argue for a new and exclusive definition of citizenship. His law was startlingly simple and for many brutally divisive. Henceforth, to be recognized as an Athenian citizen, a person had to be born from two Athenian citizen parents. Before this, the tradition had been more flexible, often granting citizenship to the sons of foreign mothers, especially if those families were wealthy or well-connected. The debate that erupted was not just about policy, it was a profound clash over the soul of the community. What truly forged a citizen's identity? Was it a lifetime of shared residence, of paying taxes, and of defending the city in its hoplite ranks? Or was it something inherent, carried in the blood, a lineage that could be traced back to the mythical founders of Attica? Proponents of the law, many from old aristocratic families, made a case for cultural purity. They warned that the city was being diluted by foreign influences, that wealthy metics or resident foreigners were marrying their daughters into Athenian families to secure political power for their grandchildren. They argued that a true democracy could only function among a people bound by a common heritage and a singular set of ancestral customs. To open the gates too wide was to risk the city losing its unique character and ultimately its independence. The opposition saw this as a betrayal of the city's practical spirit. They pointed to the indispensable contributions of metics to the economy and the military. They argued that a man who had grown up in the city, who fought in its wars and contributed to its treasury, had already proven his loyalty and earned his place. To reject him based on the origin of his mother seemed not only ungrateful but strategically foolish, shrinking the civic body at the very moment Athenian power was expanding. Yet Pericles and his supporters won the day. The law passed, and Athenian identity was officially narrowed to a matter of pure ancestry. The immediate effect was a more closed, tightly defined society. But the long-term consequences were even more profound. The law created a permanent underclass of talented, integrated residents who could never fully belong. It set a legal precedent for using birthright as the ultimate gatekeeper of political rights. This ancient debate echoes powerfully in our modern world, whenever a nation grapples with questions of immigration and nationality. Is citizenship a reward for bloodline, or is it an earned status, built on shared residence and a commitment to the common good? The choice Athens made on that day reminds us that every democracy continually decides who is a we and who is a they, and that those definitions, once etched into law, can shape a society for generations. While Athens debated the boundaries of citizenship, a new power was rising in the West, one that would face its own identity crisis in the halls of its Senate. Rome's stunning victory over Carthage had flung open the doors to the Hellenistic world, and a flood of new ideas poured into the Republic. At the heart of the ensuing storm stood two titans, Cotto the Elder and Scipio Africanus. One was the vanquisher of Hannibal, a military genius who moved with the effortless grace of a Greek prince. The other was a hard-edged senator from a humble farming family, whose very presence seemed to embody the old Roman spirit of grit and simplicity. Their clash was not over a law or a battle, but over the soul of Rome itself. Cotto launched a relentless crusade against the creeping influence of Greek culture. He stood in the Senate and railed against the new vices, the fine silks, the sophisticated philosophies, and the decadent art that followed Scipio and his officers home. He did not merely dislike these things, he saw them as a poison, a direct threat to the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. He argued that Roman strength was rooted in the soil, in the discipline of the farm, and the austerity of a life lived by strict, unwavering virtue. For Cato, luxury was not a reward for conquest. It was the first step toward national weakness and corruption. Scipio Africanus and his circle of nobles represented the opposing view. They saw engagement with Greek culture not as surrender, but as an essential evolution. They believed that a world power needed the intellectual tools of philosophy, the beauty of its art, and the diplomatic polish of its rhetoric. To them, Hellenization was not a corruption of Roman virtue, but a refinement of it, a necessary step from being a mere martial republic to becoming a truly civilized empire. This was a debate fought in every corner of Roman life. Cato famously learned Greek himself, not to appreciate its poetry, but to better attack Athenian diplomats without the filter of a translator. He pushed for sumptuary laws to limit personal spending and banished Greek philosophers from the city. Scipio, in contrast, surrounded himself with Greek thinkers and writers, making their wisdom a part of his political and intellectual toolkit. The tension they created would define Rome for centuries, a perpetual argument between looking inward to its own past and reaching outward to the wider world. It was a question every rising power must eventually confront. Does embracing a global identity mean sacrificing the very character that made you strong? Rome's fields were filling with slaves, while its returning citizen soldiers found themselves with no land to farm. This growing crisis of landlessness festered for years, a silent rot at the foundation of the Republic, until a young tribune named Tiberius Gracchus forced it into the open. He stood before the plebeian council and delivered a speech that was less a policy proposal and more an accusation. He argued that the Republic had broken its sacred contract with the men who bled for it. While soldiers were off conquering new territories, the wealthy patricians had steadily enclosed the public land, the Ager Publicus, using vast armies of enslaved laborers to work it. The returning veteran, the backbone of the legions, now had nothing. Tiberius framed this not as a simple economic issue, but as a mortal threat to the state itself. A landless citizen could not meet the property requirement to serve in the army, weakening Rome's very defense. He proposed a land reform bill that would enforce old, neglected laws, redistributing this public land in small plots to the poor and the veterans. The reaction from the Senate was one of pure, unadulterated fury. They saw this not as justice, but as a revolutionary confiscation of their property, a dangerous step toward mob rule led by a demagogue. The core of their argument was a defense of absolute property rights. They claimed that the land, though public in name, had been improved and worked by their families for generations, making it theirs by custom and effort. Tiberius, they shouted, was tearing at the social fabric and inciting the poor against the established order. When Tiberius bypassed the hostile Senate and took his bill directly to the popular assembly, he crossed a line. The political conflict escalated beyond words. On the day of a crucial vote, a group of senators, led by the Pontifex Maximus, stormed into the assembly armed with clubs and broken furniture. They bludgeoned Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his followers to death right in the heart of the city, their bodies thrown into the Tiber River. The Republic had never seen such a thing, a magistrate murdered by his peers for pursuing a popular reform. A decade later, his brother Gaius took up the same cause, pushing for even broader reforms including grain subsidies for the urban poor. He too was declared an enemy of the state and hunted down, forced to order his own slave to kill him before the mob could reach him. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers shattered an unwritten rule that political disputes in Rome would be settled by debate and law, not bloodshed. They proved that when a governing class refuses to address profound economic inequality through its institutions, it will eventually resort to violence to maintain its privilege. This was the Republic's point of no return. The moment the struggle between the people and the aristocracy became a fight to the death, setting a tragic precedent that would echo through the coming civil wars. Blood had been spilled on the sacred ground of the Forum, and the Republic's political wounds were now mortal. In this atmosphere of escalating crisis, as Gaius Gracchus and his followers mobilized the people, the Senate reached for a constitutional weapon of terrifying scope. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree. Its phrasing was deceptively simple, instructing the consuls to see that the Republic takes no harm. But this was not a mere suggestion. It was a declaration of a state of emergency, effectively granting the chief magistrates unlimited power to act outside the law. The debate it ignited was not about a single policy, but about the most fundamental trade-off a free society can make: the sacrifice of liberty for the promise of security. The senators who supported the decree argued from pure necessity. They believed Gaius Gracchus was not a reformer but a revolutionary, a demagogue whose popular appeals would shatter the Republic and plunge it into chaos. In their view, the state was facing an existential threat, and in such moments, the slow, deliberate processes of courts and legal protections were a fatal luxury. The final decree was portrayed as a surgical tool, a temporary measure to excise a deadly tumor before it could spread. For the populares, the faction supporting the common people, the decree was something else entirely, a legalized license for murder. They saw it as the ultimate hypocrisy. The very oligarchs who accused Gracchus of breaking the law were now suspending the law itself to eliminate him. Where was the Republic's famed commitment to due process when it was inconvenient for the aristocracy? The decree, they argued, transformed political opposition into a capital crime, allowing the Senate to brand any popular movement as a threat and crush it with absolute force. The terrifying precedent was set. The consul Opimius, armed with the final decree, raised a militia of knights and senators, marched against Gaius and his supporters, and slaughtered them. Afterward, he even confiscated the property of the slain, an act that would have been illegal under any normal legal proceeding. He had not just defeated a political rival, he had eradicated him with the full, chilling sanction of the Senate. This single event forced every Roman to confront an agonizing question: can a republic use the methods of a dictatorship to save itself from what it perceives as tyranny? The Senatus Consultum Ultimum created a loophole in the Constitution, one that would be used again and again in the coming decades, each time eroding the legal foundations it claimed to protect. It proved that the power to declare an emergency is perhaps the most dangerous power a government can hold, for it contains the seed of its own destruction, blurring forever the line between defending the state and establishing one-man rule. The Republic was bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, its laws twisted to justify political murder. Into this fractured world stepped a man who believed words alone could save it. Lucius Sergius Catilina, a bankrupt aristocrat, saw the Republic's weakness as his opportunity. He gathered a desperate coalition of indebted nobles and disaffected veterans, plotting a violent uprising to cancel debts and seize power. The conspiracy was real, but its exposure would hinge not on a trial but on a performance. The consul Cicero, a self-made man from outside the old nobility, discovered the plot and faced an impossible choice. He had the evidence, but a traditional legal prosecution would be slow, giving Catiline and his armed followers time to strike. So Cicero chose the Senate floor as his courtroom and public opinion as his jury. He delivered the first of his 4 Catilinarian orations with Catiline himself sitting in the chamber, a breathtaking act of political confrontation. Cicero did not present a dry legal case. He crafted a story of stark moral absolutes, framing himself as the steadfast father of the nation and Catiline as a monstrous parasite. His opening line was a searing rhetorical question that echoed through the hall, asking how long Catiline would abuse their patience. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of the conspiracy, describing secret meetings and hidden weapons, aiming to make the abstract threat feel immediate and personal to every senator listening. This was not a debate in the traditional sense. Catiline, isolated and shamed, had no real opportunity to respond in that forum. It was a public shaming on a grand scale, a use of oratory as a weapon to destroy a man's political standing and legitimize his removal. Cicero's speeches successfully branded Catiline as an enemy of the state, forcing him to flee Rome to join his waiting army. The crisis, however, was far from over. Cicero's next move would prove even more controversial. He had captured Catiline's co-conspirators who remained in the city. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including signed letters. But what was the proper punishment? Another fierce debate erupted in the Senate. The young Julius Caesar argued passionately against execution. He acknowledged their guilt but warned that putting Roman citizens to death without a trial would set a dangerous precedent, creating a new weapon for future political vendettas. He advocated for life imprisonment instead. Cicero, backed by the stern Cotto the Younger, argued that the Republic was in a state of war. In such an emergency, he claimed, traitors forfeited their rights as citizens. The safety of the people, he insisted, was the supreme law. The Senate sided with Cicero and Cotto. The conspirators were taken to the ancient prison and strangled to death. Cicero had saved the Republic, but at what cost? He had used the power of his office and the force of his rhetoric to bypass the courts, executing citizens based on a senatorial vote. The applause he received that day was thunderous, but the precedent was chilling. He had demonstrated that in the right hands, a public speech could be more powerful than a judge's gavel, and that the line between defending the state and establishing a tyranny could be frighteningly thin. The death of the Catilinarian conspirators left Cicero hailed as the father of his country, but the Republic's foundations were now cracked beyond repair. In the shadows, a far more dangerous alliance was taking shape, one that would not be so easily shouted down from the rostra. It began not with a public vote, but with a quiet, private agreement between three men who found the Senate too slow and too stubborn for their colossal ambitions. Julius Caesar, the brilliant and indebted populist Gnaeus Pompey, the Republic's greatest living general, and Marcus Crassus, its wealthiest man, formed a secret pact. To their enemies, like the unyielding Cotto, this was not a political partnership but a three-headed monster, a creature that fed on the very institutions it pretended to serve. The debate over this first triumvirate was often muffled, happening in hushed tones in senatorial corridors and the courtyards of great villas, but its implications roared through the state. Was this coalition a necessary evil? The Senate had proven itself incapable of action, blocking land for Pompey's veterans, refusing to ratify Caesar's eastern settlements, and stymieing Crassus' financial schemes. The three argued, though never publicly, that their union was the only way to break the political gridlock and provide for the needs of the army and the people. They were, in their own eyes, pragmatists forcing a broken system to work, but from the outside it looked entirely different. This was a corrupt cabal, a subversion of every republican principle. They bypassed the Senate entirely, using Caesar's consulship to pass laws written by the trio in private, enforcing their will through a combination of Pompey's veterans and Crassus' money. They even co-opted the popular assembly, turning the voice of the people into a rubber stamp for their own deals. The real debate was this: could the Republic's complex system of checks and balances, designed to prevent the rise of a king, actually survive the coordinated power of its most successful citizens? The triumvirate proved that it could not. The institutions were no match for concentrated military glory, vast wealth, and sheer political cunning. The argument was settled not in the forum but on the battlefield. When the alliance finally fractured after Crassus' death, the rivalry between Pompey and Caesar exploded into a civil war that drowned the Republic in blood. Their private pact had publicly demonstrated a terrifying new truth, that the greatest threat to a free state could come not from a foreign enemy or a mob, but from an agreement signed in secret by its own most powerful men. The secret pact of the triumvirate now demanded its public payment. Julius Caesar, serving as consul, marched directly to the popular assembly with a bold proposal: land for Pompey's veterans and a subsidy for the urban poor. He was not asking the Senate for permission, he was presenting them with a fait accompli. This was a deliberate provocation, a challenge to the very heart of the aristocratic republic. His co-consul, Marcus Bibulus, scrambled to respond. He resorted to the oldest weapon in the senatorial arsenal, religion. From his house, Bibulus declared he was watching the heavens for omens, a formal process that, by tradition, should have halted all public business. It was a transparent, desperate attempt to use constitutional piety as a political blockade. Caesar, with the crowd roaring its support, made a calculated choice. He ignored the declaration and called for the vote. The assembly passed his land bill into law. The political earthquake that followed was not about the land itself, but about the source of law. Did legitimate power flow from the ancient customs and religious observances guarded by the Senate, or from the direct, expressed will of the Roman people in their assembly? Caesar's supporters argued that the Senate, through Bibulus, had abused its authority. By hiding behind archaic rituals to thwart a popular and necessary measure, the oligarchs had revealed their contempt for the people and forfeited their moral right to lead. The people's vote, they claimed, was the true and ultimate expression of the public good. The senatorial opposition saw something far more sinister: the rise of a demagogue who used the language of popular reform to shatter the checks and balances of the state. To them, Caesar was not a champion of democracy, but its gravedigger. He had manipulated the assembly, bypassed the Senate, and trampled on religious law, all to build a personal power base of loyal soldiers and indebted citizens. This was not progress, it was the first step toward tyranny, dressed in the cloak of popular sovereignty. The precedent was terrifyingly effective. From that point on, Caesar and his allies governed almost solely through plebiscites, laws passed by the assembly, rendering the Senate a hollow, debating society. He had proven that a determined leader, with the mob at his back, could bend the republic's own democratic mechanisms to break the aristocracy. This clash over a land bill revealed the fatal flaw in the Roman system, a flaw that would ultimately transform a republic of shared power into an empire ruled by a single man who always claimed to speak for the people. Caesar lay dead on the Senate floor, but the republic he had broken did not rise from his ashes. Instead, a new struggle began, fought not with legions but with words, a final, desperate campaign waged by an old man with nothing left but his voice. Cicero, seeing Mark Antony maneuvering to seize Caesar's vacant power, unleashed his Philippics, a series of 14 speeches so fierce he named them after the legendary attacks Demosthenes had once made against a king. This was Cicero's last stand, a one-man debate for the soul of a dying system. He did not plead, he accused. He painted Antony as a drunkard, a gambler, and a would-be tyrant, a man who was not continuing Caesar's work but perverting it into pure, violent self-interest. Cicero's argument was a call to return to the ancient ways, to restore the authority of the Senate and honor the men who killed Caesar not as murderers, but as liberators who had struck a blow for freedom. He tried to rally the Senate and the people around the young Octavian, Caesar's heir. portraying him as a dutiful son of the Republic who would help them cast out the Antonian menace. But the world had changed. Antony and his supporters fired back with their own propaganda, framing Cicero as a hypocrite and a relic. They asked where was this famed republican virtue when Cicero used the senatus consultum ultimum to execute citizens without trial. They painted him as a wealthy landowner, a member of the very oligarchy that had failed the people for generations, now clinging to a corrupt past because he had no place in the new order. This war of words was the Republic's last great debate, and it proved that eloquence alone was no match for legions. When Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, their first order of business was a proscription list, a death warrant for their political enemies. At the very top was the name Marcus Tullius Cicero. His powerful words had made him the most dangerous man in Rome. Soldiers hunted him down as he tried to flee. He met his death with a grim dignity, his head and hands, the instruments of his life's work, severed and delivered to Antony, who displayed them on the very rostra from which Cicero had so often spoken. The death of Cicero was more than a murder, it was a symbol. It marked the final, brutal silencing of republican free speech. The Philippics demonstrate the ultimate power of oratory, to inspire and to condemn, to define a conflict and memorialize a cause. Yet they also reveal its ultimate powerlessness when the audience holding the swords has already stopped listening. It was a tragic lesson that in the final collapse of a state, the most brilliant argument can be shattered by the simple, unanswerable force of a blade. The bloodshed of the social war had forced a terrible question upon the Roman Senate. For years, their Italian allies had fought not to destroy Rome, but to join it, demanding the rights and privileges of full citizenship. Now, with the battlefield quiet but the resentment still smoldering, a monumental debate began. Could the Republic afford to share its most precious possession, the Roman franchise, with the very people it had just defeated? Conservative voices rose in alarm, warning of a dangerous dilution. They argued that the unique value of Roman citizenship would be cheapened if granted to outsiders. The old privileges of voting, holding office, and legal protection were the rewards for true Roman blood and tradition, the very glue that held the original citizen body together. To open the gate so wide, they claimed, was to surrender the city's soul to a flood of foreign customs and divided loyalties. On the other side stood the progressives, who saw a stark strategic necessity. They argued that continuing to treat the Italians as second-class subjects was an invitation to perpetual rebellion. The war had proven that Rome's military strength was utterly dependent on these allied soldiers. How could the Republic call on their loyalty in future crises while denying them a stake in its success? The only way to secure a lasting peace and unify the peninsula, they insisted, was through incorporation, not continued subjugation. The eventual decision to extend citizenship across Italy was a revolutionary turning point. It shattered the ancient idea that to be Roman was simply to be from the city of Rome. Now, a man from the Samnite Hills or an Etruscan city could, in law, become a full Roman citizen. This transformed Roman identity from a city-state privilege into the badge of an imperial commonwealth. The genius of this move was its psychological power. Instead of ruling a patchwork of conquered peoples, Rome now governed a nation of potential citizens, offering a path to inclusion that rewarded cooperation and assimilation. This debate established a foundational principle of imperial governance, that shared rights could be a far more powerful and stable tool of control than brute force alone. By offering a stake in the system, Rome turned former rivals into stakeholders, building a vast, resilient network of loyalty that would underpin its empire for centuries to come. A new shadow fell across the fractured Greek world. a shadow cast not from the east by Persia, but from the north by a kingdom the Athenians had long considered backward. Philip II of Macedon was not just a king, he was a force of nature, a brilliant tactician who combined military innovation with ruthless diplomacy. As his influence crept southward, the Athenian assembly became the stage for a final, desperate argument about the city's place in a changing world. On one side stood the fiery orator Demosthenes, a man whose entire political career was built on a single, unshakable conviction. He saw in Philip not a rival, but a predator, a cunning and insatiable threat to the very idea of Greek freedom. In a series of blistering speeches he called the Philippics, Demosthenes did not merely warn his fellow citizens, he tried to shock them awake. He portrayed Philip as a barbarian masquerading as a Greek, a man whose promises were lies and whose diplomacy was merely war by other means. He argued that every city that fell to Philip, every treaty he signed, was another nail in the coffin of Athenian independence. For Demosthenes, the only logical response was total, uncompromising confrontation. He demanded that Athens pour its resources into a grand alliance and meet the Macedonian army head-on. His was a call to arms in defense of an ideal, the glorious, chaotic world of independent city-states. Arrayed against this militant idealism was the aged voice of Isocrates, a teacher of rhetoric who had spent a lifetime observing Greek politics. He offered a vision that was pragmatic to the point of being painful for many to hear. Isocrates argued that the era of the proud, squabbling city-state was over. He saw the endless internal wars between Athens, Sparta, and Thebes as a sickness that had left Greece weak and vulnerable. In Philip, he saw a potential solution, a powerful, centralized leader who could, from the outside, force the Greeks to unite against their common enemy, Persia. He advocated for a policy of diplomatic engagement, suggesting that Athens should recognize Philip's power and try to steer it toward a pan-Hellenic crusade that would benefit all of Greece. This was not a surrender in his view, but a strategic adaptation to a new political reality. The assembly was torn between these two futures. Demosthenes' passionate appeals to liberty and tradition resonated deeply with the Athenian self-image. But Isocrates' cold realism asked a question many did not want to answer. Could their ancient democratic system, designed for a world of equals, compete with the efficient, single-minded authority of a monarchy? For years, the city vacillated, following Demosthenes' lead too late and with too little conviction. The debate was ultimately settled not in the Pnyx but on the plain of Chaeronea. There, Philip's army, led by his young son Alexander, crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. The hoplite citizen, the proud symbol of the polis, was defeated by the professional soldiers of a king. The independent Athenian democracy was effectively finished. This final great debate forced the ancient world to confront an agonizing transition, the end of the city-state and the dawn of the age of empires. It is a question that still resonates wherever small, democratic nations face the overwhelming power of a centralized giant, asking how much of your soul are you willing to compromise to save your skin. The execution of Socrates left a stain on Athenian democracy that no victory could wash away. He was not a conspirator caught with hidden weapons, but a 70-year-old philosopher who had spent his life debating in the city's public spaces. His trial in 399 BCE was a public spectacle, but his defense was anything but conventional. He was formally accused of not believing in the city's gods and of corrupting the young men of Athens. Yet everyone in that courtroom knew the real charge was far more profound. For decades, Socrates had been the city's intellectual gadfly, relentlessly questioning everyone from politicians to poets, exposing their unexamined assumptions and pretended knowledge. In the wake of a devastating war and a brutal oligarchic coup, the public mood was fearful and vengeful. Many citizens saw Socrates not as a seeker of truth, but as a corrosive force. His most famous students, like the treacherous Alcibiades and the ruthless Critias, had brought Athens to its knees. The debate in that courtroom was not about a crime, but about the very soul of the city. Could a democracy tolerate a citizen whose primary activity was to question its most cherished beliefs? The prosecutors argued that his constant skepticism eroded the religious and moral foundations that held the community together. In a society where the gods were believed to protect the city, encouraging doubt was not an academic exercise, it was an act of civic sabotage. Socrates, in his own defense, refused to appease the jury. He did not beg for mercy or promise to change his ways. Instead, he delivered a philosophical provocation. He argued that his questioning was the greatest service he could offer Athens. By forcing his fellow citizens to examine their lives, he was not corrupting them, but cleansing them of ignorance, which he called the true corruption of the soul. He compared himself to a stinging fly, necessary to prevent the great and noble horse of Athens from becoming sluggish and complacent. He famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. The jury, by a narrow margin, found him guilty. When given the chance to propose an alternative penalty, he suggested the city should reward him as a public benefactor. This final act of defiance sealed his fate. The court sentenced him to death by drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. His calm acceptance of this unjust verdict, detailed by his student Plato, became a powerful symbol of intellectual integrity. But his death left a wound that never fully healed. Did Athens kill its conscience, or did it justifiably eliminate a subversive element in a time of crisis? The trial of Socrates forces us to ask whether a healthy democracy requires unwavering loyalty to its traditions, or the constant, unsettling challenge of free inquiry. It is a tension that every free society must navigate, balancing the need for social cohesion against the disruptive, essential power of a questioning mind. Savage reprisals had long been the blunt instrument of imperial power, but now Rome faced a more delicate question. The once great kingdom of Macedon lay defeated, and in the aftermath, the Roman Senate turned its gaze to the wealthy island of Rhodes. This maritime power had been a loyal ally for years, but in the final conflict, its leaders had hesitated, even attempting to mediate a peace between Rome and its enemy. To many senators, this was not mere neutrality, it was betrayal, an act that demanded a brutal response. The debate that followed would redefine the very logic of empire. The war hawks, their voices loud and angry, demanded Rhodes be made an example. They argued that only the shock of total destruction, the seizure of its lands, and the enslavement of its people would deter other allies from ever contemplating disloyalty. Fear, they claimed, was the only language subject nations truly understood. But then Cotto the Elder, a man famous for his rigid and uncompromising nature, rose to speak. He shocked the assembly by arguing not for vengeance but for clemency. His genius was to reframe the entire issue. He did not appeal to morality or to the gods. Instead, he presented a cold, pragmatic case for mercy as a superior form of control. He asked his colleagues to consider the view from the outside. If Rome crushed a former friend for the simple crime of hesitation, what message would that send to every other kingdom and city-state in the known world? It would tell them that Roman friendship was a trap, that any misstep, no matter how small, led to annihilation. Such a reputation would not bring security, but perpetual insecurity, forcing every ally to live in terror and secretly wish for Rome's downfall. A reputation for fairness, Cotto argued, was a strategic asset. By sparing roads, Rome would demonstrate immense confidence, a strength so absolute it could afford to be generous. This calculated mercy would bind other nations to Rome more tightly than any treaty signed under threat. They would see that loyalty was rewarded and that even mistakes could be forgiven, creating a web of voluntary allegiance far stronger than any chain of fear. Cotto's unexpected plea carried the day. Rhodes was spared, losing only some territory and its independent foreign policy. This single debate marked a critical evolution in statecraft, the moment a republic began to master the subtle art of hegemonic power. It proved that the most durable empires are not always built on terror, but sometimes on the calculated, self-interested virtue of the strong. For 10 long years, the Roman Republic stood locked in a political stalemate so profound it felt like a second constitution. The tribunes of the plebs, Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius Lateranus, refused to back down from a single, revolutionary demand. They proposed that of the two consuls, the chief executives who commanded armies and presided over the state, one must always be chosen from the plebeian order. To the patrician aristocracy, this was not a reform. It was an existential threat, a desecration of a sacred office they viewed as their divine birthright. The very air in the forum crackled with this unresolved tension, a decade-long debate that asked a question which cuts to the heart of any democracy. Can a system claim to be equal when the most powerful offices are reserved for a single hereditary class? The patrician argument was rooted in tradition, and they believed in the favor of the gods. They claimed that only their ancient priestly knowledge, passed down through generations, qualified them to interpret the divine will and lead the state through its sacred rituals. To place a plebeian in the consulship, they warned, would bring down divine displeasure upon all of Rome. It was a monopoly disguised as a sacred duty. Licinius and Sextius, along with their plebeian supporters, countered with a powerful, practical reality. They argued that political rights were meaningless without the power to enforce them. A plebeian assembly could pass laws, and tribunes could veto patrician actions, but as long as the ultimate executive authority remained exclusively in patrician hands, the plebs would always be second-class citizens. What good was the right to complain about a consul's decision if you could never yourself become the consul who made it? This was a fight for the soul of the Republic's executive power. The breakthrough came not from a sudden change of heart, but from relentless, organized pressure. For 10 years, the tribunes used every tool at their disposal, blocking patrician initiatives and keeping their single demand at the forefront of public life. They made the normal functioning of the state impossible until their rogations were heard. The patricians, faced with a political blockade they could not break, finally relented. The Licinian section laws passed, and for the first time, the doors to the highest office in the land were forced open. The election of Lucius Sextius himself as the first plebeian consul was a moment that reshaped Roman history. It did not create a democracy of the common man, but it did something equally profound. It integrated the wealthiest and most ambitious plebeian families into the ruling class, creating a new, blended aristocracy. The old patrician oligarchy was broken. The conflict of the orders had reached its climax, proving that persistent, peaceful political agitation could dismantle centuries of privilege and forge a more inclusive state from the inside out. The vote against Thebes was a gamble on Athenian independence. Just a few years later, that gamble appeared to have failed catastrophically. Theban armies, under the brilliant general Epaminondas, marched into the Peloponnese and shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra. Suddenly, the balance of power the Athenians had tried to maintain was gone, replaced by a single, dominant Theban hegemony. The assembly was forced to confront a painful reality. Their rejection of the alliance had not preserved their autonomy. It had merely allowed a new and equally formidable rival to rise unchallenged. The debate now shifted from a question of strategy to one of survival. How could Athens navigate a world where its two traditional counters, Sparta and Thebes, had been reduced and elevated in such dramatic fashion? The orators who had once warned against Thebes now faced a city gripped by a new fear, that of isolation. This single decision, made in the charged air of the Phoenix, demonstrates the perpetual dilemma of democratic foreign policy. The desire to remain free from entangling alliances can sometimes create a vacuum, a space that a determined power will inevitably fill. The Athenians learned that autonomy is not a static condition to be preserved, but a dynamic position that must be constantly defended and recalibrated against the rise and fall of empires. A new kind of conspiracy was brewing, one that met not in shadowy back rooms but in the woods under the cover of night. The Roman Senate discovered that the cult of Bacchus, a wild, ecstatic religion dedicated to the god of wine, had spread like a vine across Italy. Its secret initiation rites and mixed-gender gatherings, filled with frenzied dancing and wine, struck the conservative Roman elite as a direct assault on the family and the state itself. The debate that erupted was not about theology but about power. Was this just foreign superstition, or was it a hidden network plotting rebellion? The voices calling for suppression were loud and fearful. They argued that these nocturnal mysteries were a perfect cover for political conspiracy, corrupting the morals of the youth and, most alarmingly, turning wives and slaves against the authority of their husbands and masters. The cult's very structure, operating outside the official, state-sanctioned religious channels, was seen as a rival government in the making, yet other senators urged caution. They warned that moving too harshly against a popular movement, one that offered emotional release and community to many, could spark the very unrest they feared. Crushing a religious practice so violently might turn devoted followers into martyrs and ignite a fire they could not control. The Senate's ultimate decision was a masterclass in controlled suppression. They did not ban the worship of Bacchus outright, which would have been impossible. Instead, they issued a decree that stripped the cult of its dangerous elements. No more than 5 people could gather for a rite. No man could be a priest. No secret oaths were permitted. Every meeting required the prior approval of the Senate, effectively bringing the wild god under the direct supervision of the state. This was more than just crowd control. It was the state formally claiming the authority to police the boundary between private belief and public order. The Roman state had declared that any organization, even a religious one, that operated in secrecy and challenged traditional social hierarchies was a threat to the republic itself. This pivotal moment established a legal precedent that would echo for millennia, asking a question every society must eventually answer: where does the right to worship end and the need for state security begin? The sands of India were still fresh on their boots when Alexander's veterans learned of his next ambition. He turned his gaze toward the vast and unknown deserts of Arabia, planning yet another campaign of conquest. A deep, weary murmur began to ripple through the ranks of his Macedonian army. These men had marched to the very ends of the known world, winning an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus River. They had endured unimaginable hardships, and now they were being asked to push onward into another hostile land, all for a glory that seemed to have no end. This growing discontent was not a formal debate held in an assembly, but it was a political argument of the most potent kind. It was the will of the army, the very foundation of Alexander's power, rising up to challenge the autocrat's insatiable vision. The core question was simple and profound. What was the ultimate purpose of all this conquest? Was the goal an endless expansion of territory, a personal quest for immortal renown that demanded constant, bloody effort? Or was the point to finally stop, to consolidate the staggering gains already made, to build cities and administrations, and to allow the soldiers who had won this empire to finally enjoy its fruits? The veterans, many of whom had served for over a decade, argued for the latter. They were exhausted, rich with plunder, and yearned to return to their homes and families. They saw the Arabian campaign not as a necessary next step, but as a dangerous and pointless indulgence of their king's vanity. Alexander, in response, did not simply issue commands. He had to persuade. He appealed to their own sense of honor and destiny, arguing that true greatness could never rest, that there were always new horizons to conquer and new legends to be forged. He was trying to win a debate against the growing pragmatism of his men. The tension was a powerful reminder that even the most absolute ruler depends on a form of consent from those who enforce his will. Alexander's sudden death in Babylon cut this critical discussion short, leaving his empire to shatter into fragments as his generals fought for the spoils. But the question his veterans raised echoes through history. It asks whether any system, even a militaristic monarchy, can sustain a vision of limitless expansion when the people who must carry it out have reached their own human limits. Even a Spartan king could feel the weight of endless war. For 10 brutal years, the hoplite phalanxes had marched back and forth across the Greek mainland, and the body count was staggering. The conflict had settled into a grim stalemate, draining the treasury of men and morale. In the Spartan assembly, a profound debate was underway, a clash not of swords but of philosophies that would determine the fate of the entire Greek world. On one side stood the Ephesthene, Elatus, a hardliner who embodied the most uncompromising Spartan ideals. He argued that to accept the terms offered by the Athenian envoy Nicias was to admit defeat. True Spartans, he thundered, did not negotiate with an enemy, they crushed them. Compromise was a poison, a slow-acting weakness that would rot their legendary discipline from within. For Esthon, Elatus and his supporters, the only acceptable outcome was total victory, no matter the cost in blood and time. Across this ideological divide stood King Cleisthenes. He made a pragmatic, almost heretical argument for peace. He spoke openly of the city's exhaustion, of fields lying fallow without men to tend them, and of a generation of warriors being ground into dust. He framed the proposed peace not as a surrender, but as a strategic pause, a vital opportunity for Sparta to recover its strength and rebuild its forces for the conflicts he knew would inevitably come. The very fact that this debate was happening at all and in public was a stunning admission. The famously rigid Spartan state, built on a foundation of unwavering military obedience, was revealing a deep internal fracture. The citizens, the homoioi or equals, were weary. They had felt the personal loss of brothers and sons, and the abstract goal of total victory was beginning to pale against the immediate reality of their depleted homes. When the assembly ultimately voted to accept the Peace of Nicias, it sent a shockwave through Greece. It proved that no society, no matter how disciplined or how deeply it is steeped in a warrior ethos, is immune to the simple human desire for an end to suffering. The Spartan people, in that moment, chose pragmatic survival over ideological purity, a quiet but monumental victory for weary citizens over the relentless drumbeat of war. 2,500 years later, the same arguments echo in our modern halls of power. The Roman Senatus Consultum Ultimum, that final decree sacrificing liberty for security, finds its chilling parallel in every legislative debate over emergency powers and anti-terror laws. We still grapple with that same agonizing trade-off, asking how many of our freedoms we are willing to surrender for the promise of safety. The economic desperation that drove the Gracchi brothers to demand land reform is mirrored in our own fierce discussions about wealth inequality, fair taxation, and the very purpose of a social safety net. The fundamental question remains unchanged. What does a society owe its most vulnerable citizens, and what happens when that debt goes unpaid? Even the classic confrontation between the dazzling Alcibiades and the cautious Nicias replays itself in every election cycle. We are still seduced by the charismatic voice that promises glory and transformation, often wrestling with the more prudent, less thrilling voice that warns of overreach and unsustainable cost. These 25 ancient clashes were never truly settled. They were not problems to be solved and filed away. Instead, they established the enduring questions that every generation of a free people must answer for itself. Democracy is not a static achievement, a monument we built once and can simply admire. It is a continuous, vital, and often messy conversation, an unfinished argument that we inherit, contribute to, and must pass on intact to those who follow. From the fiery oratory of the Athenian Phoenix to the calculated rhetoric of the Roman Curia, these 25 pivotal moments were the laboratories where democracy was tested, refined, and sometimes shattered. They demonstrate a profound truth we often forget, that a healthy democracy is not measured by the absence of conflict, but by the quality of its arguments. Its strength lies in the resilience of its institutions to channel those inevitable clashes into something productive, rather than letting them erupt into violence. Think of the patient, structural genius of Cleisthenes, who redesigned an entire political map to force cooperation among rivals. Remember the painful lesson of the Arginusae Trial, where the city learned that even the popular will must be tempered by the rule of law and the right to an individual defense. These stories are not about ancient perfection, they are about ancient perseverance. The true legacy of these debates is the framework they built, a set of principles that prize the courage to speak, the wisdom to listen, and the critical integrity to abide by a collective outcome, even when you disagree. The historian Thucydides offered a timeless insight when he wrote that the secret of happiness is freedom, and the secret of freedom, courage. It takes courage to stand and voice an unpopular opinion, to question a charismatic leader, or to admit a terrible public mistake. That ancient courage is the very fuel for our own democratic engagement today. Which of these ancient clashes resonates most deeply with the political conversations happening in your own community? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to continue exploring the great mysteries of history.